Okay. So where we left off, and you guys were looking at the warm-up here, is, you were cycling through the process of how they make a decision in the case. So what's the mechanics of how they look at a case? You know, when you look at those mechanics, you're thinking about all the steps involved and the personalities involved. And then we're thinking about the types of rulings that they can come out with. But where we left off is the factors that influence how a judge rules. So we talked a little bit about precedent being one of the most major factors, that stare decisis, let the decision stand. We talked about judicial philosophy, whether or not they were using judicial restraint or whether they saw themselves as an activist, whether or not they thought about original or strict construction. Beyond that, I kind of had a listing of what other factors are there. And there's ideology. Ideology and philosophy are different. One is how they see their role as a jurist. The other is, a bigger idea about the role of government. So those are kind of separate concepts. Public opinion weighs in. We see the court will evolve as public opinion evolves. So they don't maintain 1800 values. They will adapt and evolve. Where I left off was talking, and judicial character is another factor. This is partly where I left off. The personalities, the ability for those 9 to find actually clicks within the 9. And where I left off, and I was doing this in a rushed format, was talking about the social background. What's interesting is if you look at Garland, you've got, if he were ever to be considered, which it looks like there's actually a meeting today between he and the chair of the Judiciary Committee to discuss, basically for the chair of the Judiciary Committee to say, here's why you're not having a hearing. That's the purpose of the meeting, to tell him why there's not going to be a meeting. If Garland were to be considered more seriously, what you'd see is this concentration, that you've got 8 members on the court studying at Harvard, Yale, or Columbia. Maybe you want that. Maybe that's better than a Phoenix Online. I don't know how well Phoenix Online does their education, and maybe it's good. I don't mean to demean them, but maybe you do want top flight, Ivy League kind of individuals, but that suggests, again, maybe a lack of diversity and therefore a lack of perspective. 4 are born in New York, 2 in California. So again, it's hard to get diversity with 9. How do I represent 50 states with 9? But even if you can't represent all 50, maybe you could represent more than 2 or 3, right? You've got what would be 4 justices of the Jewish faith. And again, given the diversity of religious identities out there, this suggests kind of a concentration. Now, that having been said, Peter, you may have to find it for me again. I was relieved to kind of, find that I always feel inappropriate when I'm up here being flip about diversity. And what's nice is for a black president to be flip about it. That kind of saves me from feeling any kind of guilt. And he means it tongue in cheek. He doesn't mean to diminish anybody who is black or lesbian or anything like that. But what he's saying is there's a bit of ridiculousness to think about how I'm looking for a particular candidate who contains all the demographics that I want to represent. I do want to represent these demographics. But you've got kind of the cart before the horse if you're thinking about, let me find that candidate who has all these demographics that they represent. Again, that having been said, as difficult as the task is, it does matter. Because, when we look at Roe v. Wade and we look at the background of Justice Blackmun, who was an attorney for the Mayo Clinic, he had connections to the medical world. He had daughters. His daughters and his wife, were part of discussions that led him to kind of see this issue differently. So background does matter. Right? The last chunk we want to talk about is we've done all this work to kind of analyze how we get to a decision. But getting to a decision and actually implementing it can be leagues apart. So there are some keys to whether or not the decisions of the court actually are carried out in a manner that leads to implementation that affects more than the parties that were involved in the lawsuit. Will this have a global or systemic impact? Some of that depends on how well crafted the decision is. Again, we want exemplars and we're beating it to death, but Brown v. Board with all deliberate speed is a great example of where you have language that kills the implementation, and likely deliberately so. You also need to look at not just the language of how it's written, is it feasible? When you write it, you've got to start moving to the idea of practicality. How are we actually going to implement this? And you have to think, very critically about your language. You also need to think about, will I have presidents that get behind this? Now, again, Eisenhower was a little tepid on desegregation. He wasn't your biggest advocate, but he does still send troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to make sure that the schools are open in Little Rock for the students that were being sent. Jackson is the opposite example. When we have the Worcester versus Cherokee that says that the Cherokee Nation is a distinct, independent, sovereign nation living within the United States, and that the federal government is the only entity that is empowered by the Constitution to negotiate treaties and diplomatic relations with them, not the state of Georgia. Georgia ignores. And Jackson does not send in the troops. He was willing to do so when they were ignoring tariffs, when we had the whole controversy surrounding the tariff of abominations. I'm not willing to send in troops this time. In fact, I'm willing to go on public record as sabotaging Marshall, saying he's made his decision, I'll let him enforce it. He could have, conversely, used the public kind of, public speaking and forum to promote this decision. The bully pulpit is a tool that the president has to either garner support for a decision or diminish it. Obama recently has used public forums to talk about speech now, which allowed essentially, almost unlimited anonymous spending in the form of super PACs. And he's condemned that publicly. And what he's hoping to do is maybe generate a social movement that eventually causes enough pressure on the courts to rule differently if a case were to come up again. Again, remember, the implementing public, the political climate does weigh on the court. They're fairly insulated from it, but over time, it can cause them to shift. Now, the president isn't the only key party, so is Congress. Congress can work to counter a decision by rewriting a law. If something is unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional, but you can figure out alternatives, maybe legislatively. Okay, this was struck down. What about a different version of that? They can use their constitutional powers, and we've been over that. We can, threaten or actually restructure the courts. We can strike down nominees via the Senate's power of advice and consent. Only going after Samuel Chase, but arguably you could use the power of impeachment. Legally we have to be kind of creative with a new law. We don't have a great success rate, but potentially an amendment as well. These are at least tools that they have. They too can use public forums. A great example of that is that trend, amongst members of the legislative branch to rail against the courts. To talk about unelected, officials serving for life who are legislating from the bench, these activist judges, and that's gained traction. Congress certainly isn't held in high esteem. People love their congressmen, as evidenced by a 90 to 95% incumbency rate, but Congress and its approval rate hovers, in the teens and 20s. So. They've gained some traction lately trying to, put some focus on the courts. I think courts typically are held in much higher esteem, but this damages. The other implementing population he needs are state and governmental units. implementation happens all the way down on the local level. What's interesting is, just as an exemplar, if you look at the issue of prayer in school, we've had a lot of rulings on, the high wall of separation and where your right to religious freedom kind of ends as it enters into the public sphere. That having been said, a lot of schools still have, events, ceremonies that might start with a prayer. Graduation ceremonies might start with a prayer. They might have things that cross the line in terms of, biblical readings or things posted within the school. And the reason why is because the local population kind of allows it. If there's not a challenge, it stands. So you need the local population to also kind of uphold it. And some of that depends, too, on understanding. Another exemplar would be Roe v. Wade, which left some ideas of the interest of the state to protect the life of the mother and the unborn fetus. And that is enough of a window for states to put on different and increasing levels of restriction in the later trimesters. And again, if there's not a challenge, that stands. So you need state and local governmental units to kind of uphold it. They're the kind of it happens at the local level, and you need the public to understand it and either coalesce behind it or challenge it if it's not being upheld. Okay, so with that, we wrap up. We say goodbye to Allie. And